Hi everyone and welcome to the next part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote, all that matters on the chessboard is good moves. Food for thought coming from Bobby Fischer. Now a review of the last part where we begin the third chapter, the 7th and 8th ranks, and discussed some examples given by Nimzowitsch regarding introductory concepts of the choice of an objective and achieving the objective with acoustical echo or tempo of a check, and then also discussed the first two of 5 special cases in the 7th rank. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch discusses regarding the third special case in the 7th rank. He explains this with the position on board and writes, the third special case, the drawing apparatus for perpetual check, rook plus knight. Black has 3 embryo queens, so white needs to draw by perpetual check. Knight h7 check, king e8 and knight f6 check fails because of king d8. The solution is found in rook d7, since now after e1 queen, the drawing apparatus works to perfection. Observe that the key move rook d7 brings the rook and knight into strategical contact. Let us, in the same position, imagine a black rook at c8. In this case, rook d7 would not suffice, but would also be unnecessary, for his own rook at c8 stops the black king's flight and makes a sentinel at d7 superfluous or unnecessary. So in this case, knight h7 check, king e8, knight f6 check, and if king d8, rook d7 would be mate. The black king was a clever fellow. He committed suicide in the middle of the board, when a less talented sovereign would have been satisfied with the corner with this purpose. Moving further, Nimzowitsch explains the fourth special case in the 7th rank, which is the marauding raid in the 7th rank. He explains this with the position on board and writes, the fourth special case is quite simple, but is indispensable in view of the very complicated fifth case. It consists in a driving maneuver. The king will be forced out of his corner, and then will follow a marauding raid. An example, rook h7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, king f8, rook f7 check, and wins the black bishop. A necessary condition for success was the protected position of the rook at h7. Had it been otherwise, king g8 would have prevented capture of the bishop, since the rook on h7 would be hanging. In this fourth case, the capacity of the combined rooks to drive the king from his corner to f8 or c8 must be noted. This capacity provides the basis of the fifth case. So now Nimzowitsch discusses the fifth special case in the 7th rank, which is combined play in the 7th and 8th ranks, enveloping maneuver in the corner of the board. He explains this with the position on board and writes, the 5th special case. In the position, white, who designs to seize the 8th rank, tries to do this by low cunning, since the direct road seems to be barred by the black queen. He seizes the corner, drives the enemy king out of it, and thus makes room for the enveloping attack of his rook. Rook h7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, king f8, and now rook h8 check, winning the queen. The position arrived at after the two checks at h7 and g7 is the typical starting point of all enveloping maneuvers in the 7th and 8th ranks. To elaborate this further, Nimzowitsch gives a similar position on board here. He writes, the analysis of this position shows us two rooks, each ready for a turning movement, but also a resourceful king whose contact with the rook at g7 protects him from the worst, that is, mate on h8. So long as this contact is maintained, mate cannot be given. The black king's case is somewhat like that of a pedestrian who is set upon by a mugger, who raises his weapon to strike, but the former seizes his arm and keeps fast hold of it, knowing that so long as contact is kept up, the robber cannot use his arm for the decisive blow. And so the rule runs. The king who is threatened by an enveloping attack must maintain contact with the nearer rook as long as possible. The rooks on their side must seek to shake loose from the contact. The second rule follows directly. The king who is threatened must struggle towards the corner. The rooks must and will drive him from it. Nimzowitsch continues, starting from the typical position, white can try three maneuvers: A for immediate material gain, B for a mating combination by breaking off contact between king and rook, C for a tempo winning combination. A for immediate material gain has already been considered. If, say, an enemy queen stands anywhere in her first rank, there will result from the position rook h8 check, with the win of the queen for the rook at g7. B for a mating combination by breaking off contact between king and rook. Contact can be broken either through the protection of the rook at g7 by pawn or piece, or by driving away the king by a check from another quarter. For example, in the position on board, there follows bishop b4 check, king e8, and now the rooks have a free hand to deal the death blow, rook h8 mate. Instead of a bishop on e1, we may imagine a pawn at e6, and the continuation would be e7 check, king e8, rook h8 check. The enveloping operation has been made possible, but the black king has now a flight square which before was close to him. As such, king d7. But this plays no role. for the air we have allowed him was alas poisoned. E8 queen with double check, and mate is not far off. Nimzowitsch then gives another illustration to explain the same concept with the help of a diagram where we have this position on board. He writes, first, white gets the typical position as shown before. Rook g7 check, king f8, rook h7, threatening mate on h8. As such, king g8, the flight towards the corner. Rook g7 check, king f8, and now there follows knight g5. F takes on g5 and f6 with mate to follow at h8. Or knight g5, d4, knight e6 check, bishop takes on e6, post, f takes on e6, followed by the driving of the king from f8 by e7 check, and history repeats itself. This check at e7, which breaks contact, could only have been parried by rook e8, leading to the loss of a rook. For example, rook e8, e7 check, rook takes on e7, rook takes on e7, and white wins easily, even if black has one or two passed pawns to the good, for there would have brought into play that capacity which rooks possess, to which we have called special attention, of attacking fleeing pawns from their rear in the 7th rank. Moving further, Nimzowitsch elaborates on the third maneuver from the typical position, which is for a tempo-winning combination. He explains this with the help of another diagram where we have this position on board. Nimzowitsch writes, with rook h7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, and king f8, the typical position is reached. But how are we to proceed? Neither A, rook h8 mate, nor B, forcing a break in the contact seems feasible. Of course, if the white king were already at g5, then king h6 would follow. But as matters stand, it would seem as if white must content himself with perpetual check. However, appearances are deceptive. There follows rook takes on d7, threatening mate at h8. So king g8. Now white repeats the little maneuver, rook g7 check, king f8, rook takes on c7, and again black is forced to play king g8. They have no time for the a1 queen of their dreams. If our opponent has no time for something which otherwise would be most advantageous to them, because they are forced to make some positional move irrelevant to their purpose while we advance our project, then we have gained a tempo. So king g8, and white now plays rook g7 check, and the ending runs king f8, rook takes on b7, king g8, rook g7 check. Rook takes on a7 instead would still be a gross error by white because of a1 queen. So rook g7 check, King f8, rook takes on a7, rook takes on a7, rook takes on a7, and white wins the black a pawn and the game. We may sum this up thus, that in the third maneuver from the typical position, we have the case that white gathers new strength by touching the typical starting position, or more simply, by bringing about this position, he creates a new mating threat and so a free tempo for gathering loot, that is, gain of tempo. Nimzowitsch closes the chapter with a couple of endgame illustrations. He writes, "We have now sufficiently illustrated the 5 special cases and have made it clear that the first thing to do is bring about the starting point position. We will close with 2 more endgames. The board shows the position which white had obtained after 50 moves in the tournament game at Vilna, or present-day Vilnius, Lithuania, in 1912. Aron Nimzowitsch versus Osip Bernstein, who was a Russian-French grandmaster." Nimzowitsch continues, "My opponent here played rook f8 in order after f6 to reduce the material on the board to such an extent that there would not be enough left to win with. I answered calmly, rook takes on b4, f6. For now I manufacture out of its several components my first special case in the 7th rank, passed pawn and 7th rank absolute, which was even at that date known to me. The continuation was bishop c5, rook c8, forced. Rook f7 instead fails after rook b7. Rook takes on b7, a takes on b7 check, king takes on b7, e takes on f6, and black's bishop has more work than they can do. So rook c8, e takes on f6, rook takes on c5, f7, the passed pawn, rook c8, rook b7, the 7th rank absolute. The extra enemy piece is an illusion. Bishop d3, rook e7, obviously. Bishop b5, king f4. White avoids rook e8. Bishop takes on e8, f8 queen, though thereby he treats himself to the pleasure of getting a new queen, since after bishop c6 check and rook takes on f8 to follow, the queen vanishes, and with her also all joy. So king f4, rook h8, h7, bishop a4, king e5, bishop b5, king f6, e5, and king g7, where black resigned. And now Nimzowitsch gives the second endgame illustration with the help of a diagram where we have this position on board. It is from an odds game played between Aron Nimzowitsch and Elias Stam, a player regarding whom I could not find much information. The game was played in Riga 1910, and Nimzowitsch with the white pieces gave odds of his queenside knight to black here. Nimzowitsch writes, in the position here, there first occurred a6 and queen a8, threatening rook a7 and rook takes on a6 to follow. In this difficult situation, White saved himself by the following subtle trap, as the Dunaziten called it, or by a combination based on a thorough knowledge of the terrain, 7th rank as we would call it. The Dunaziten, from what information I could find over the internet, was a daily newspaper published in Riga around the time, but was later discontinued. Nimzowitsch continues. The game went on b3, rook b8. Better to be sure would be rook a7. But rook b8, and now followed the queen sacrifice. Bishop a3. Rook takes on b6. Bishop takes on d6. Rook c8. Rook takes on g7 check. King takes on g7. Bishop e5 check. King any move, and the rook gives perpetual check on h8 and h7. It is worth noting that after the queen sacrifice, white has at least a draw in all variations. For example, queen takes on a6 here instead of rook c8. Then comes bishop e5, king e8, rook h8 check, king d7, rook h7, queen a2 check to leave the square a6 open, king g3, d5, rook takes on g7 check, king c6, rook takes on c7 check, king b5, rook takes on c5 check, king a6 and rook a8 check, winning the black queen. Or queen g8 here. Bishop takes on c7, rook takes on a6 and b takes on c4, followed by bishop e5. Or queen g8, bishop takes on c7, c takes on b3, bishop takes on b6, b2, rook takes on g7 check, queen or king takes on g7, rook h1 to follow, and white has much the better prospects because of their strong a pawn. The chapter ends here. However, noteworthy is the move rook takes on a6 here, which still wins for black with over 4 pawns of advantage, and was perhaps overlooked by Nimzowitsch while studying this line. I mention this only for the sake of our understanding and with the utmost of respect to Aron Nimzowitsch, since I have the luxury of very strong modern-day engines to assist me in my quest for understanding. A sample line runs as following. Bishop takes on c7, rook a1, rook takes on g7 check, king takes on g7, bishop e5 check, king f7, rook h7 check, king e8, rook h8 check, king d7, rook h7 check, king c8, rook h8 check, king b7, rook takes on a8 and rook takes on a8, where black should win with a relatively accurate play being the exchange up and still carrying an advantage of over 4 pawns. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall begin chapter 4, the passed pawn, from the next part. Shout out to Walkerboy for gifting 6 subscriptions to viewers on my Twitch stream last week. Fellow streamer Skwerly with 3 gifted subscriptions. Christopher James for subscribing and gifting a subscription. Parmenides 1 with 1 gifted subscription. ChessFabregas and fellow streamer Farraway for continuing their subscriptions. Walkerboy, the top chairer with 500 Twitch bits, and Watches at second with 64 bits last week. Thank you for the support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.